Unprecedented dissent in China over severe COVID restrictions. Demonstrators clash with police as protests continue for a fourth day. They're chanting, "We want freedom," but will the government quash their anger with force or change its policy to appease the people? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is China's protests. It's been an extraordinary weekend of protests across China over zero COVID restrictions. In Shanghai, demonstrators clashed with security forces on Sunday, with police taking away a busload of protesters. In other cities, including Wuhan and Lanzhou, COVID testing facilities were overturned, while students gathered on campuses across China chanting slogans like, "Xi Jinping, step down." The unprecedented protests were sparked by anger over an apartment fire late last week in the city of Urumqi that killed 10 people. Protesters say the lockdown measures slowed rescue efforts and prevented people from escaping the building. It's a claim city officials deny. COVID measures in that area are now being eased. Well, still, the fire sparked a movement across the country with people expressing various grievances, not just anger at lockdowns. Here's what some had to say.
From Beijing, Lamar says, "We live in an autocratic world, and what we hope to see the most is for China to have true democracy and freedom." Summer K says, "The pandemic and the codes have brought us so much torture, and now there are more people becoming unemployed."
Well, China is now in its third full winter of severe lockdowns. The first reported case of COVID-19 came from Wuhan in December of 2019, and since then, the country's been adhering to its zero COVID policy. Well, China says it's saving lives, but the World Health Organization says the policy is wrong. Let's take a closer look at how it works.
Most of the world has accepted that COVID-19 is here to stay, and we must learn to live with it, at least to a certain extent. China, on the other hand, is following a policy it calls dynamic zero. This means reacting whenever cases are detected and working to squash outbreaks before they take hold. Authorities argue that uncontrolled outbreaks will put many vulnerable people at risk. The measures are extremely strict. Confirmed cases are taken to centralized quarantine centers, and those living near them are subjected to mass testing and tight restrictions on their everyday lives. Residents are often confined to their homes, with schools and transport closed. Barricades are erected around districts, and in some places authorities have been known to place cameras outside people's doors or even weld them shut. In recent months, lockdowns have taken place in several cities at the same time. Two of them are Shenzhen and Shanghai. These lockdowns have meant factories and ports have closed for long periods. The result is that China's economy has grown by 3.9% over the past year, well short of the 5.5% target for 2022. Initially, China was held up as an example of a country handling the virus relatively successfully. Now the World Health Organization says their approach is unsustainable. It says the current Omicron variant, which is more infectious than others, is almost impossible to contain. President Xi Jinping says the zero COVID policy is scientific and effective, and the overall number of infections and deaths remains comparatively very low in China. But the growing dissent shows that the people are tired of the strict controls. To keep the peace, the government may need to find a way to control the disease without controlling the people.
So how much of a public health threat is COVID now, and how much social and psychological damage can be justified to save lives? Joining me now from Birmingham, UK, is Dr. Lawrence Young. He's a professor of molecular oncology at Warwick Medical School. Thanks so much for being with us, Doctor. First, as a doctor, tell me what you make of China's unique approach, and tell us how actually zero COVID is compatible with the science that says we have to live with COVID. We can't make it go away. So technically zero COVID would be impossible.
I think that's what we've learned through all of the pandemic. Many countries tried a zero COVID policy and it doesn't work. The only thing to say, of course, is that it has resulted in China in far fewer deaths, certainly compared to countries like UK and the USA. But there's a big price to pay for that. And we're seeing the price now in terms of social unrest, economic damage, and indeed a real problem with how you break out of a zero COVID type of approach without causing severe disease in your population.
Tell us more about that. What do you mean causing severe disease in your population?
Well, one of the big problems is we've got a very toxic mix here in China now of really a combination of vaccine hesitancy, because many of the population are thinking, well, zero COVID means there's no virus, therefore we don't have to get vaccinated. So there's a real issue about that. There's an issue about the fact that the vaccines that have been used in China are less effective than other vaccines around the world. And because the population has been so protected and they haven't had waves of infection, there's a real issue about the lack of a wall of protective immunity. So you have a very, very significant problem with most people not being infected, not being vaccinated, or having durable vaccination.
Right.
And this could result in very high levels of severe disease and death, and that's the big problem.
Yeah, there's a lot to discuss there, but let's start with the vaccine issue. Why has China been so reluctant to deploy an mRNA vaccine that has been proven to be more effective, but actually isn't patented in China still?
Yeah, well, they are moving towards patenting their own mRNA vaccine now. And I guess, yeah, they were developing their own more traditional weakened forms of the virus as a vaccine. And it does work. There's no question that it does protect, but it doesn't give you the longevity, the durability of protection. And the big problem they have actually is the fact that the older population are not coming forward for booster jabs. So there's a lack of confidence and as I said earlier, vaccine hesitancy. And there's something like 80 million people over the age of 80 who've not had their booster jab and will have very low levels of immunity from previous vaccinations. So they're going to be really susceptible. And the worrying thing there is that could result in a catastrophic death toll.
Okay, then tell me, I mean, is there any way that this could actually work? That somehow in the longer term, China can turn around and say, see, we told you so, we knew this would be tough, but our zero COVID approach really is better, not just for the lives saved, but for, I don't know, stopping the mutation of the virus further or any of the other possible side effects that could be there?
Yeah, I don't think there is. I think you have to weigh up the whole issue of the damage you're doing economically and socially against the number of people you're getting vaccinated. It's true that they have a very effective test, trace, and isolate approach, but they're so stringent about it. Whereas I think what we should be doing in the West more is continuing to test, trace, and isolate, but use that in a very controlled and targeted way. This approach that they have in China, which is quite amazing, where they see a few people infected and they shut down an entire city, is just not viable long term. It's understandable that in the early days of the pandemic, when we didn't have a vaccine, when we didn't understand much about how the virus was spreading, that you'd have lockdowns. That's what we suffered in other parts of the world. But continuing with this zero COVID policy is putting them into a very, very difficult position.
Right. And when we talk about, the numbers, I mean, nobody is testing like China. So how do we know actually that other countries don't also have record case numbers as well? It doesn't seem to really matter in the rest of the world whether the numbers are there, because the bottom line is people are not getting as sick. But what they are now, what they are getting sick with, though, now is the psychological effects and the stress of not being able to manage your finances and work and be with other human beings. Talk to us a little bit about the medical effects of that kind of emotional stress on people.
Yeah, I think, Andrew, we're seeing the outcome of that, aren't we? And given what's happening currently in China, that you can only take this so far, and then you end up having a breakdown in society. People will not accept being restricted in such a way, having to have PCR tests all the time and being isolated, struggling to feed themselves, etc. That you can only do that for a very short period of time, and indeed that's what we experienced in the UK. The population will only accept that very extreme lockdown for a short period of time, and there's no need to do it in a situation where you do have good vaccine uptake and you've been robust about rolling out booster shots, particularly to the elderly and most vulnerable. And that's where China have fallen down. And I think they've got themselves into a real dilemma here, because they know that if the virus just rips through the population, they're going to end up with many, many people dying.
Dr. Lawrence Young, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us on this edition of the Newsmakers.
Thank you.
Let's broaden out the discussion now and welcome three new guests. From Beijing, we have former Chinese diplomat and chair professor at Soochow University, Victor Gao. From London, we have Duncan Bartlett. He's a research associate at SOAS China Institute and the editor and presenter of China in Context podcast. And from Sheffield, UK, Colin Alexander, an author and senior lecturer in political communications at Nottingham Trent University. Thanks all so much for being with us. Victor, I'll start with you. Why has the rest of the world moved on and China has not? Most everyone has really accepted the risks now because COVID-related deaths have plummeted with new COVID strains that just aren't as deadly. So everywhere else has moved on except China. Why?
First of all, for the past 3 years, China has been embarking on a very unique and extraordinary path in dealing with this pandemic. As a result of very stringent dynamic zero COVID policy, China has suffered the least amount of deaths and infections comparing China with any other country, you name it. And if we use the numbers in the United States, which has suffered more than 1 million deaths, and the Chinese population is more than 4 times that of the United States, you should have expected that China's death rate probably would reach 4 million at least. And if you consider US has much better health facilities than China as a rule of thumb, then China's total death probably could have reached 8 million to 10 million. In that sense, China has reason to believe that it has made great breakthroughs and accomplishments in saving as many people in China as possible, in preventing as many people from deaths as possible or infections. But on the other hand, we need to shift to another paradigm, that is saving as many people and also avoid disruptions of daily life and normal economic businesses.
So you recognize that some changes do need to be made. But let me ask Colin quickly, this unique and extraordinary path, as Victor describes it, I mean, is it legitimate? Is it justifiable given that there have been fewer deaths? Or have the psychological and economic costs been far too overwhelming?
Well, that is the key debate here. I mean, at one level, you might have saved people from a particular set of circumstances around this one virus, but the collateral damage from the lockdowns and from quarantines is enormous. Children having stunted educational growth and development, the mental health crises that people have around isolation, and then the abhorrent levels of economic damage that it does to economies and people being laid off from jobs that they take pride in, for example. So yes, there has to be a balance, but it seems that China is really out of kilter with most other countries around the world.
Right. Duncan, let me ask you this, because it was interesting how Victor described that, acknowledges that this is a unique path. It is a completely different approach. And, I think it's fair to say there are a lot of kind of conspiracy theories around different countries' approaches to COVID. And some have said that in China, part of their approach has been somewhat an experiment to see how much control there can be over the population in circumstances like this. And part of the protest element is about that the control is just too much and it's not actually about protecting people anymore. What do you say to that?
Well, at the 20th Party Congress, which took place in Beijing recently, the Communist Party made it pretty clear that it had two objectives. One was to suppress the spread of the virus, and the other was to get economic activity back to normal. And it's really failed in both of those objectives. So the virus has been spreading, and there have been consecutive days with record numbers of people being infected with COVID in China. And then we saw disruption to economic activity with a riot at a factory in China which makes iPhones, that's the Foxconn factory, and then a very severe escalation in the social protests which took place at the weekend and continued into Monday. The very significant point about that is that people aren't just complaining about the government's COVID policies, they are complaining about the governance of China. So people on the streets of Shanghai were chanting, "Down with the Chinese Communist Party, down with Xi Jinping," This is a direct threat to China's leadership.
Duncan, does any of this, you can tell me if this is too far a stretch, but I have heard it mentioned, I'm sure you have too, how much of this would someone say is reminiscent of Tiananmen Square?
These are the largest protests by people in China since the Tiananmen Square uprising in 1989. And we have yet to see really what the response from the authorities is. Some of the videos that we've watched coming out of Shanghai show that the police have been confronting the protesters on the streets. Now look, these protests so far have not been violent, but remember what happened in Hong Kong in 2019. The police and the authorities took very strong measures to quell those protests, and they've now introduced a national security law in Hong Kong, which means that there's almost nobody who's taking to the streets to complain about the rule which is being brought onto Hong Kong from Beijing. So there's a much more authoritarian approach in Hong Kong than there was a few years ago, and we'll have to see whether that actually is the response to the protests that have been taking place in Shanghai and elsewhere in China in the last few days.
Interesting. Okay, Victor, let me ask you, I mean, does the fact at least that restrictions are now easing slightly in Xinjiang and its capital, Urumqi, does that tell us now that the government is listening to protesters?
Well, first of all, I think the protests need to be very carefully analyzed, and the legitimate concerns expressed in the protests need to be addressed with very quickly and comprehensively. On the other hand, allow me to mention that China has been in this transition since the end of October. So it's about 1 month already, and different cities have started to test different ways of relaxing controls and restrictions. Sometimes you have better results, sometimes you have counter results. So China as a whole is continuing with these experiments with the goal of achieving greater flexibility and greater removal of restrictions to allow normal business lives and economic and daily lives for the people. So we are in this process of transition. And in a sense, transition is very, very difficult and maybe very costly and very risky, because you are moving from one paradigm which has been tested and proven for 3 years, whether you like it or not, to a very new paradigm which is not yet fully tested. And you are talking about China with 1.4 billion people. Now, just allow me to remind all of us, China's population is larger than all the OECD countries combined.
No, nobody
so
can.
This is not easy job at all.
We can't argue with these statistics. We are arguing though at what cost is this really coming when you talk about how many lives are saved. But anyway, Victor, you seem to feel that there is somehow an exit plan moving forward?
I do believe so. First of all, in looking at different countries dealing with the pandemic in very different ways, you need to at least agree with me on one thing. That is, China and the Chinese government, the Chinese nation, do put a very high premium on saving lives. Sometimes we save lives for elderly people in their 80s or 90s, and each life saved will be a great occasion for joy for the Chinese people. We do not consider elderly people as negative assets, for example. We want to do whatever we can to save their lives. Now, secondly,
but it's interesting you say that, because that's exactly what the protesters are kind of angry at, that their lives have been put second to the lives of already very vulnerable and elderly people. It's been at too much of a cost to the other lives in China.
Allow me to share with you what I believe in. I think in dealing with the pandemic, we need to care about our self-interests, which is very important, but we also need to care for the macro social interest, especially for a country like China with 1.4 billion people, with great disparity between urban side of the equation versus the rural side of the equation. And you are talking about vaccines. It is very, very difficult to push vaccines effectively to a total population of 1.4 billion people. 40% of the population still lives in rural areas, inaccessible in many cases because of distance, rugged terrains, for example. And we need to really look at China in a more balanced way. For those protesters, while I agree with many frustrations they have I do not agree with them for some of the political demands they are raising. This is against the mega trend in China. China is very united after the 20th Party Congress, and stability is the key of assuring us greater success going forward.
Okay. Colin, let me come back to you. I mean, the fact of the matter is this has all taken on a political dimension now. And as you say, these protests are really kind of unprecedented since even Tiananmen Square. Do you think the Chinese government will regret having enforced this policy as strictly as it has?
Well, I don't know if they'll regret it or not. That's to be seen. I mean, I'm just going to pick up Victor on one point, and he says that the Chinese government sort of saving lives is something to be celebrated. No, that's just the job of the government, right? We're not, we shouldn't be celebrating that in China, or shouldn't be celebrating that in Turkey or the UK or anywhere else. That's just a basic premise of governance, is to try and help the public. I think the other thing to say is, look, we've got to look at why do people protest, particularly in a non-democratic state where the right to protest is a bit more restricted. Ultimately, what we see with people, one, they protest because they feel that there's a personal issue going on here. Second reason that they protest is because they feel that there is a moral aspect to it. They feel that there is a moral injustice which is going on. And the third reason is because they think that there is an abruptness to this. There's like an urgency that one must do something now. So, and to do this in a state like China, it involves a degree of risk to people. So there is a lot of dissatisfaction in what's happening here. The other thing to say is that Xi Jinping at the party conference talks about his sense of the China dream. That involves a harmonious society. What we're seeing is not a harmonious society.
Let me come to Duncan because, we're down to our last few minutes. I mean, there kind of are three options here, I think, for this protest movement. It will either fade away, it will lead to some serious change, or there could be just a complete crackdown on this kind of dissent. Any idea where you think this is going?
Well, there's a bit of a cat and mouse game going on, isn't there? Because people are filming these protests on their mobile phones and taking photographs. They're being captured by China watchers outside of China, particularly people in Hong Kong, Taiwan and Singapore who are looking at what's happening. But we don't really have the other side of the story, do we? We don't really know what's going on inside the Chinese Communist Party as they're deciding their strategy in response to these protests. My expectation is that they will take a hard line because that's what happened in Hong Kong in 2019. But will they be able to satisfy people's demands for more protection and better living circumstances and more secure jobs? They'll have a lot to do in order to be able to meet the protesters' demands.
Victor, just quickly, because you talk about that there is kind of an exit plan somehow, not exactly sure how it will work. There have been a number of complaints in China about the efficacy of the Chinese vaccine, which has really been the only one to be deployed when it's known scientifically to be less powerful than the other mRNA vaccines. Will that be part of the exit strategy for China to just take on, perhaps import vaccines that are believed or proven actually to be more effective than the Sinovac vaccine in order to get out of the danger of this pandemic?
Well, you know for sure China was one of the first countries to introduce vaccines in dealing with this COVID-19 pandemic, and China has fully cooperated with WHO and with more than 100 countries in the world in sharing the Chinese version of the vaccines with many countries in the world. Now, you talked about Western countries' vaccine. I personally hope we will have access to them as soon as possible, but the government's position is reciprocity. That is, for example, between China and UK, we need to reciprocally acknowledge the vaccines of the other country and give access to each other's vaccines on equal basis. Now, whether the customers want to use that particular vaccine imported to China, that's a secondary question. But each country needs to acknowledge the vaccine of the other country and give equal access to the vaccines. This has been China's policy since the beginning of the pandemic. It remains China's policy. And I do hope more countries will cooperate with China to make sure that this reciprocity principle is observed and more foreign vaccines can have access to the Chinese market.
Okay, fair enough. Colin, we're just down to our last minute, so very quickly, overarching here is a lot of negative press for China in the international media. How do you think this affects Chinese leadership and the Chinese people?
Well, just going back to what I was saying before about protest, I mean, particularly in non-democratic governmental situations where people come out onto the streets at considerable risk to themselves. One of the big issues here is that what we see is tipping points. So it's often very small issues which then lead to these waves of protests and the sort of copycat protests which happen. So you can go to, sort of the Tiananmen incident, or you can go to Taiwan with the 228 incident, 1947. What we just see is there's these small incidents where people's tolerance for the way in which they're governed, they just begin to feel like this is just unacceptable now.
Colin, I'm going to have to interrupt you there. Very unfortunately, we're completely out of time for this edition of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists sincerely so much for being with us, and our viewers, of course, for tuning in as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.